Hey everybody, welcome to Holy Week. Throughout the course of this whole week, we're going to be offering resources that we hope will guide you along the way through the story of what happens with Jesus in these last 6 and then 7 days after Palm Sunday, the last days of his life, and then the promise that comes in resurrection. We have the opportunity this year to spend some time with a deeper dive in some of the events and episodes that happen in this week in a way that we don't usually get to. We'll get to the moments that are most familiar to us, moments like the betrayal of Jesus and the cross and the Last Supper and the foot washing. We'll get there, but we have a chance here in the first part of this week to unpack some of the other important episodes that happen in the last week of Jesus' life, that sort of set the stage for the way everything just explodes like a powder keg there between Thursday and Friday, and maybe to give some deeper context. Some of those moments in this story are ones that feel very, very worshipful to us. We know how the story goes. They're familiar to us, and so our way of dealing with them, our way of engaging them, is going to feel more worshipful. But some episodes in the week of Jesus' last week of his life, before the cross, feel different. They may be more confusing or perplexing or less familiar, or we never get around to talking to them because they feel like they always take second fiddle to the foot washing or the Last Supper, and we're not quite sure what to do with some of these other moments or scenes or stories. Or to be honest, they seem like they are not ripe for writing hymns and songs and anthems about, and so we just sort of leave them alone. So I want to ask tonight, or today, whenever you're watching this, that you join me in a deeper dive in an important episode that happens just after the story we call Palm Sunday, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and that sort of parade that happens opposite the Romans' entry into the city as well around Passover. And we'll take a deeper dive, sort of almost like Bible study kind of a way here in this conversation. And then we will get to other kind of moments where we can do more worshipful and prayerful times as well. But this seems like a moment that we need to do a little bit of what's going on here. So if you'll first indulge me here, let me read from Matthew chapter 21, and then we'll have a little bit of conversation. The story is one you might well know, but it goes like this. This is literally right after the triumphal entry. People waving the palm branches. They've all said their hosannas and all that. And immediately, this happens next as Matthew tells the story. Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you prepared praise for yourself?" He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. So here's this weird scene. It's one that breaks maybe all of our preconceptions about who Jesus is and how Jesus operates. One, because most of the time Jesus is so gentle and tender and fulfills that image from the scriptures about someone who won't even break off a bruised reed and won't quench a dimly burning wick. And now here Jesus sort of tromps in, angrily upset. Sometimes folks like to use this scene as proof that, look, it's okay to be tough and macho and beat people up because Jesus did it. He drove people out of the temple. And other people say, well, this is a story where Jesus is trying to stop corruption, and so Jesus is just so passionate and full of righteous zeal for stopping corruption in the temple that's what's going on. Either way, and maybe there's a million other variations in between, it just blows our categories. It's upsetting to think that Jesus walks into the central, most important religious and national site of his people. The center at the heart of the capital of the city of Jerusalem is the temple. And there Jesus walks right in while ordinary business is going on. People are offering sacrifices, people getting animals they need to offer sacrifice. Jesus walks right in, takes the money, and just sort of knocks everything over. it's hard to make sense of what's going on in this story. And for Christians, for us church folk, we are sort of predetermined, pre-programmed to recognize Jesus is the one we should be rooting for in any story. So we assume he's the hero. How can anybody else not see what he sees going on? And on the other hand, everybody else in the scene seems to think that Jesus is a crazy person, or he's a deliberate villain who's destroying the most central important thing in their religious and cultural and political life. It's confusing to make sense of this story because we're not sure what kind of hat Jesus is supposed to wear. We're used to seeing all the characters in a story, in a movie, as either, white hat wearing good guys, oh, good guy, white hat, or black hat wearing villains, like this. And the question we're left with is, what's Jesus, and why is it that nobody seems completely clear on what sort of person Jesus is, especially when Jesus has this way of not wearing any of the hats we insist he wears, and Jesus breaks all of our categories and instead talks about loving enemies. So, if you'll bear with me, let's back up for a minute about what's actually going on and maybe some of the other layers going on in this scene. When Jesus walks into the temple, and just to get a sense of the gravity of it, this would probably be something like if you walked into the heart of Washington, D.C., into either the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument, or because there's obviously religious overtones to the temple and not just national or cultural political ones, the Washington National Cathedral. And if you all of a sudden started vandalizing and knocking over the entry gate or the turnstiles for walking in, or started smashing up things in the gift shop, people would be upset about that, right? Because, and maybe rightly so, they would assume you are attacking a symbol of all that is good and right about our country, right? You would treat it almost like an act of terrorism if somebody starts making threats against the National Cathedral or the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Monument. And the temple has all those kind of put together. Anything that Jesus does that causes a stir in this place is going to be upsetting to a lot of people who feel like Jesus has stopped being nice, friendly, itinerant rabbi and religious teacher and occasional worker of healings, and now he certainly is acting like a violent zealot or like a domestic terrorist. And nobody wants to see the powder keg that is Judea blow up with violence in that situation. So, okay, some of that's all floating around. Let's zoom out even bigger to see what's going on in the temple and maybe what Jesus has to say about his presence in the story of God and God's people. Let's zoom out super, super far back before we even get to things like buildings and temples and structures. Let's get the old whiteboard out, okay? Reaching back to the furthest memories of how God and human beings relate to one another. The opening stories of Genesis, imagine, here we are, we human beings, and we're made for relationship with God. Now, right off the bat, we human beings have a way of imagining that God is somewhere else, that God is up somewhere. That's usually how we picture God, and we are down here. And then the question becomes, how do we relate to a God who is somewhere off there? And of course, most of human history is all sorts of attempts of trying to get the God or the gods to do what we want, or to listen to us, to answer our pleas for rain and a good harvest, or for sickness to be recovered, or for bad things to happen to our enemies. An awful lot of human history and religion all around the world are imagining and assuming this kind of a picture. There's God or the gods up here, human beings down here. How do we bridge the gap? What thing do the gods need? Do they need sacrifices? Do they need prayers? Are there certain moments or places or times when we can more effectively get to God? But it assumes God up there, human beings down here. The scriptures, the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, what we usually call the Bible, don't really assume that. We kind of project that onto them, but really maybe a better picture of how the Bible assumes things or starts is something more like this. God fills all of the universe. All of creation is bigger than all of the universe, and we live within the creation that God has made, and all of creation is always completely permeated by the presence of God. It's God's presence between every neutrino and electron in all the universe that allows things to continue existing. God is not somewhere off there that we have to get to. God is always immediate to us, and we live, as the scriptures say, in God we live and move and have our being. You can't be anywhere and not be in God's presence, not even, as the scriptures say, in the realm of the dead, on the highest mountain, in the bottom of the ocean, or in your living room. There's nowhere you can be where God isn't. That's important, maybe reminder for us in these days when we often can't be in church buildings but have to figure out how to do church together separately in houses and in phone calls and in emails and in written letters. But important to remember, it's not that God up there and me down here somewhere. God fills all of creation, and you and I live in the midst of God's presence. Okay. But to be clear, a lot of human history has not assumed that, but instead we've ended up with other pictures of how and where God lives. So, after you get out of that initial picture of how things are supposed to be between us and God in the early stories of Genesis, by the time you get to the book of Exodus, the people of God, these formerly enslaved Hebrews, are set free from Pharaoh's Egypt. And Pharaoh sort of milks that whole picture of God's up here, people down here. Pharaoh just pictures that he's one of those gods up here, and he has control and pull with all the other gods, and if you don't do what Pharaoh says, he'll make things bad for we peons down here. But as the freed slaves come out of the Exodus experience, the God who speaks to them, the God who's revealed in the name Yahweh, I am who I am, the God of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Rebekah and Leah, that God wants to communicate clearly, I will be with you. So that God says, I'll tell you what, I'm sending you a covenant. You keep your copy on the stone tablet, I'll keep my copy on the stone tablet, but you keep yours you keep my copy with you, and put them in a wooden box. Carry it with you from place to place to place as you go. That will be a reminder, not only of the relationship you have with me, but that I am going with you on the journey. So all throughout the story of the wilderness wanderings, the people carry around with them this wooden box that has gotten a lot of press because of Indiana Jones movies, called the Ark of the Covenant. And in the covenant they put 2 stone tablets, which are probably not commandments 1 through 5 over here and 6 through 10 over here, because God couldn't make the handwriting any smaller, but more likely 1 copy for the people, 1 copy meant to be representing this is God's copy of the covenant, and that both are kept in a wooden box that had poles for carrying, and any place the people went, the box went as a reminder that God was going with them. Now, at their best moments, the people understood God did not live in the box. God doesn't reside in any physical place. God fills all of creation. And part of how they knew it was back in the Exodus wandering days. The wooden box was not all that exciting. It was a wooden box. They put some little gold flourishes on the top. But the really exciting thing was that everywhere they went, God's appearance and glory appeared as this big sort of swirling fire tornado, a pillar of cloud and fire that went with them from place to place to place. It reminded them that God didn't live in the wooden box. God was infinitely bigger and more glorious and mysterious and vast, and the pillar of cloud and fire wasn't even all that God was. It was a symbol. It was this visible thing. People could say, oh, okay, God's leading us place to place to place to place as we go along. But at their best moments, the wandering Israelites understood God did not live in the box. Now, it didn't take too long before the people decided, you know what, in addition to having a wooden box that we're going to keep the reminders of God's covenant and God's presence with, you know what, we should put like a tent that the box can go in, because, you know, we need to keep the box sheltered from the rain. So they took the wooden box that God didn't ever really live in, and they built a tent for it. They called it the tabernacle. And the idea was, okay, God doesn't really live here, but we human beings, we need some notion of a place where we can come face to face with God. So we'll build a tent and we'll keep the wooden box in there, but we'll all remember God doesn't live inside a box, right? But it's we human beings who are limited to geography and place and time. We can only be in one place at one moment, so we need a place where we can think about or process the idea of coming to the presence of God, even though God is really all places, all times, always, right? Okay, fair enough. The idea of a tabernacle still, this idea of this tent, nobody really thought God actually lived only in the tabernacle, probably because it was basically a glorified tent. And everybody knew, oh, God is just far too glorious to actually live inside a tent. The tent is for our need, not because God actually needs it. People were clear on this. But after enough time and enough centuries pass, a king by the name of David has this bright idea. He thinks, you know what, it seems awfully like a shame that I get to live in a permanent house and lovely palace with wood-paneled walls and everything. That's actually what he says. Go read it in the book of Samuel. He's excited that he's got wood paneling in his house. I've got these delightful wood-paneled walls, and God is still living in that tent back there, the tabernacle. That's not right. We should build a permanent structure for God's box to dwell in. Now, maybe David knew God doesn't really live in a box, but he doesn't seem to be prepared for the possibility that people will misunderstand and abuse a box with a big building around it, where God's box lives. David doesn't get to build the temple, but his son Solomon does. And at that point, you have in the center of the temple the box, the Ark of the Covenant. And around that, you have a small room called the Holy of Holies, and around that you have another room, the holy place, the regular old basic entry-level holy place, and around that there's an even bigger wall and a courtyard. You've literally created a building that is a series of boxes. And when they build it, the official word that King Solomon prays is, "Oh dear Lord, you fill all of creation. We know you don't live inside any building made by human hands. We know you don't actually live inside the box or the room that the box is in or the slightly bigger building that has the room that has the box. And we promise we'll always remember that, but we built this for you, God." It doesn't take long for people, even well-meaning people, to forget, to misunderstand, or to treat the building with the room with the box as the place where God lived, as though God really is confined to this space. And at its worst and sloppiest moments, that meant that the people kind of treated their temple and the Ark of the Covenant inside it like a lucky charm. Like it doesn't really matter how we treat one another because we've got the box where God lives. You know, the place where we come to meet God face to face. We have the box, and as long as we have the box and the room where the box is and the building where the room where the box goes, God will be on our side and we'll do whatever we want. God won't let us get defeated by our enemies because God doesn't care if we practice justice and mercy. God only cares that we have control of the box. And very, very, very subtly and insidiously, nobody ever meant it to happen this way, but it all becomes a bit like the way we treat genies and their magic lamps in the fairy tales, right? If you control the lamp, you control the genie. And even though the genie is very, very powerful, if I control the lamp, in you go. I control the powerful being because I control the itty-bitty living space where the genie resides. And that's what happened with the way the ancient Israelites came to see God. Now again, we human beings for thousands of years since then continue to have this same problem about wanting to put God in a box, because then we can control our notion of God, right? So there's where things stand. They even build not only a set of walls and rooms for the box where God is to reside, but they also put a curtain up. Again, with the good intention of sending the message, of reminding the people, God is different from us. God is beyond us. God is holy. God is transcendent. God is mystery. And God is not ordinary run-of-the-mill, right? That God is holy, and we need to remember that piece about God. But basically, over enough time, human beings invent this notion that we can contain God inside this box with a room, with a building outside of it, and gates around outside that too. And as long as we've got the building with a room, with a box where God's presence dwells, nothing bad will happen to us. Well, something bad happened. Part of God's insistence all throughout the story of what we call the Old Testament, the story of the Hebrew Bible, is that God remains fiercely free to allow those structures and things that we turn into gods, to allow them to get knocked down from time to time, to remind us who is God and who isn't. And so after repeated warnings, in fact, after century upon century upon century of God saying, I wanted you to practice justice and mercy toward each other. I never was really that interested in the box you put me in. God eventually says, the surrounding empires are closing in, and I'm going to let them destroy this temple, because I need you all to be clear that I never lived in the box in the first place, and the box was never my permanent address, nor was the box a lucky charm you could use to bribe me or make me do things for you. So as important as that temple was, and as important as the curtain was inside the temple that blocked people from even seeing the place where the box was, at some point in about the year 586 BC, the Babylonians come and destroy the temple, ransacking it, taking it of all of its treasures, and destroyed. In that moment, a crisis happened in ancient Israelite and Judean thinking. They had to wrestle. Is God dead? Because our temple got destroyed. So is God no longer alive? Or are the Babylonian gods more powerful than our gods, that our temple got destroyed and their temples are still standing? Or did God make this happen? Did God send this as punishment for us? What do we do with all this? And for that matter, if we're getting carried away into exile in Babylon, whose God will be there? Will the Babylonian gods be there? Do we have to pray to the Babylonian gods? Or can we still worship the God we always knew, who lived, we thought, in that box, in the room, in the building, in our home country? What will happen? So this beautiful moment happens when the prophet Ezekiel has this vision. He's always having weird visions, and this is a particularly weird vision. Ezekiel has this vision before the temple gets knocked down by the Babylonians, and it's hard to exactly picture what he saw, but he says, I saw something that had wheels within wheels within wheels, and there were wings on it, and God's glory got up inside this thing with wheels upon wheels upon wheels. I think I've made it kind of looking like the Harry Potter golden snitch here. But this God-mobile, God's glory gets into, and before the temple gets destroyed, God's glory departs and heads east toward Babylon, toward exile. So Ezekiel's answer is, you know what? God never was limited to this box or this building. If you want to think about it this way, think about it like God got up and left the temple long before it got destroyed. God went out to be in exile with us, so that God was waiting there for us before we even got there, waiting with open arms to welcome us to go through exile with us, just like God had been present with our ancestors as that pillar of cloud and fire going through the wilderness step by step by step along the way. Fair enough. Temple destroyed, the people begin to wrap their brains around the idea that God could be with them in exile, but exiles eventually end. And when the people come back from exile, their initial first thought is, we need to build the temple again. All right. It seemed important. It seemed like an important part of life as they had remembered it. So they start working on a temple again, only this time the box, the wooden box, has been lost. The Ark of the Covenant vanishes. We don't know for sure at what point it got lost forever in the dustbin of history, but it never comes back after the Babylonian exile. Whether it had gotten sent down to Egypt or taken by the Babylonians or looted or destroyed, or like Indiana Jones suggests, in some warehouse somewhere, it sure wasn't in the second temple. There is this empty space where the Ark of the Covenant should have been. The whole point of having a temple at the beginning was, we need a building in which we can store our wooden box, where we keep the signs that remind us that God is with us. And when they build the second one, it's empty. There's no Ark of the Covenant inside it. Well, it still seems important to them. We need to have this temple. We don't think God actually lives there, but we should build a temple anyway. So they start to renovate, to build the temple. And then when Herod the Great comes to power, he lived maybe about a generation before Jesus. He's toward the end of his reign when Jesus is born. Herod embarks on this massive project of public works to sort of, puff up his legacy, where he can do lots of things with fantastic fortresses and building projects and constructions, all so that people will remember his supposed greatness, meanwhile being a terrible human being. But one of the things he did was he expanded the temple. So instead of this smaller empty building where it has no Ark of the Covenant, they had a bigger one. It was even more glorious, probably, than the one that Solomon had built back in the 900 BC. It's got courts upon courts upon courts, and it's got limestone and gold and all kinds of stuff like that. And they even brought back that idea of having a delightful curtain that would keep people out of the innermost place, the Holy of Holies, inside of which was not the wooden box, not because it wasn't there anymore. But they were back to this thinking all over again. And on top of that, by the time the second temple got built, in around the beginning of the 1st century, so just like in Jesus' formative years, you've got the Roman Empire occupying, and this is sort of the central memory, the central landmark where their national identity, their religious identity, their cultural identity all come together. The temple isn't just what we think of as a church building. It's more than that. It's like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the National Cathedral, all rolled up into one. It's the central place where all of their identity was sort of held together, even though there wasn't a wooden box called the Ark of the Covenant anymore in it. And there were a lot of people who had invested a lot of their energy in keeping this system going. There were people who worked at the temple. There were people who raised animals to be raised as sacrifices in the temple. A whole lot of commerce happens here too. And everybody's afraid if something happens at the temple, that means the markets are going to take a hit too. There's all sorts of reasons you want this to stay stable if you are a person living in 1st century Judea, in particular in Jerusalem. And if anybody said anything that sounded even a hint like bringing harm or threatening this temple thing, it called to mind all those ghostly memories of when the Babylonians came and knocked their building down the first time. And so if anybody heard anything that sounded even a whiff of, like, I'm going to destroy the temple, or I'm going to shut the temple down, or watch how I close things down, even for just part of the day today, you got accused of, you're doing exactly what the Babylonians did, or you're going to cause such a ruckus, the Romans are going to come in with an iron fist, and they're going to come in and just sort of tramp on us to destroy us and put down any troublemakers because they want to stop anybody they think is disturbing the peace. Or they would perceive you as like a domestic terrorist plotting some kind of destructive act. To say anything about the temple is a dramatic thing. And Jesus is no fool. Jesus knows that when he steps into the temple and starts knocking over tables, that can't help but be provocative. So let's, right off the bat, clear away any interpretation that Jesus walks into that scene and doesn't realize that this is going to stir up trouble. Okay? Even if you could say there was corruption going on and some people were being cheated out of a fair price for their sacrificial animals, there are other ways to register your complaint. If you just start knocking things over, you are symbolically destroying the temple. In a way, similarly, if somebody goes, just a random angry person, goes to some public place and starts spray painting and defacing it, they know they're not going to be able to destroy, say, a monument or a statue or something like that, but their intent is to strike at it and to protest against it. Jesus can't help but be interpreted as protesting or defying or threatening this structure around which so much of ancient Judean life is centered, and that is provocative. Now, the thing that makes it difficult is, we Christians, again, assume Jesus is the hero of any story that he is in, and with good reason. Everybody else sees what Jesus does in the temple, and it becomes the beginning of grounds for charges against him, at least the only charges that seem to stick. When we get to the trial scene coming up in another couple of days, there are all sorts of conflicting accounts about what Jesus did and what he said and what he claimed to be, and nobody can quite agree, except everybody seems to have this recollection. Jesus said and did stuff that seemed to be a threat against the temple, and when Jesus is confronted about it and given the chance to say, oh, no, I don't mean to replace the temple, I don't mean to knock it down, Jesus had the opportunity to say, oh, no, I was merely speaking figuratively. John, the gospel writer, will say something like that. Well, he wasn't speaking about the literal temple, he meant the temple of his body because he was going to die and rise. But Jesus doesn't take the time to say, oh, no, I love this temple building you've built, I totally think it's a great idea. He doesn't say that. Instead, Jesus says and acts in ways that suggest he's okay with knocking down that whole system of having a building with a room with a box where God lives. Because that's exactly what Jesus has come to do, to become the new meeting point between God and humanity. And as scary and provocative as an act as it is to suggest we don't need a temple, that is exactly the way Jesus saw things, that he himself becomes, in his own human life, becomes the meeting point between God and humanity. That Jesus himself becomes that meeting point at which we encounter God and God encounters us. So that Jesus himself becomes this embodiment of the relationship we were supposed to have at the beginning, where God is immediately present to us in all places, at every point in all of creation, and nobody gets to be the gatekeeper to say you're not allowed to see God unless you do what I say, unless you obey what the king decrees, unless you give me money for a sacrifice. Nobody gets to do that because God meets us instead in the human life of Jesus, who goes to the cross for us as that meeting point between God and humanity. That really is radical stuff. See, sometimes we take this story about Jesus in the temple and make it like, well, Jesus, he really got misunderstood. Jesus wasn't doing anything all that dramatic. Jesus wasn't doing anything that deserved death. No, Jesus was saying provocative stuff that would have upset anybody. People who worked at the temple, people who were ordinary citizens who built their whole worldview around the temple is where God lives. He certainly was doing things that were threatening to Herod and to the Romans because he was questioning the whole system that held everything together. And Jesus thought it was worth it because he's convinced ultimately that he's that meeting point. In the rest of this week, as we tell the story about what happens at the cross, understand Jesus seems to be laying the groundwork for us to rightly understand that no longer is a temple necessary for us to meet God, because we never actually needed a temple in the first place. Jesus sort of points us further back in the story and says the problem wasn't that you've got a corrupt temple. The problem was the temple itself. God was always kind of ambivalent about, because God warned us. You're going to start thinking, I live inside the box, and I don't live inside the box. You can't control access to who else is allowed to get close to the box, because I don't just live in the box. And so much of our religious history has been us trying to set up different rooms and gates and walls and fences to make sure only the right people get access to God, when Jesus says, nope, it turns out God meets us in all of our raw humanity there in the cross of Christ. And there God and humanity embrace and interlock the way we were meant to be in relationship all along from the very beginning. There's more going on in the cross, more going on in the Passion story on Good Friday and on Easter Sunday than just that, but at least that much is going on. So as we proceed further on this week, I want you to keep that in the back of your head, that what happens in the temple as Jesus overturns tables with the money changers isn't just an isolated episode that we can forget, but in fact is sort of like a culmination of the whole story of how God keeps trying to relate to us, and we keep saying, God, jump in this box and then we'll control you. And God keeps breaking open the boxes and saying, let me come to you directly again. Every time we human beings invent a God box, even with the best of intentions, we find a way to misunderstand it, to abuse it, and then eventually to start putting our trust in the box instead of the God we think we can put in there. At the cross, we discover a God who is unbound. That's part of why the temple curtain gets ripped in two from top to bottom, so to speak, as if to say, whatever barriers we thought were there between us and God ain't there. Maybe they never were there in the first place. But God's intention at the cross of Jesus is to bring us back into relationship the way we were created for in the first place. Where God fills all things, every moment of your life, every place you go, and there is no place you can be where God ain't present already. That's the reality we step into in the rest of this week. That's why what happens in this week is good news. You can't keep God in a box. It turns out you can't even keep God on a cross. So tune in next time as we continue our Holy Week journey with more deep dives and then our prayerful reflection as the story turns toward the cross too. Bye, and peace be with you.